So I'm pleased to welcome you to Tamaquag Museum's Lunch and Learn series. This free educational program has been made possible with the support of many, including the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, the United Way, the Island Foundation, and of course, the community support from donors like you. Tamaquag's theme for this year is the preservation of history. 2025 marks the 350th anniversary of the Great Swamp Massacre, a topic we will cover this year along with many others to inform and educate on the significance of Indigenous history, perspective, and the changes and challenges faced by Native peoples throughout the development of what is now called America. A quick reminder to place yourself on mute. Feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat, and we will address them as time allows at the end of our presentation. Finally, while you're here, our guest today is Brad Lopes, an educator and Aquinnah Wampanoag citizen with a background in classroom education, museum studies, and research. Working in classrooms for 5 years, Brad implemented decolonized approaches to social studies curriculums and instruction for students of many different backgrounds. Outside of the classroom, Brad has also worked in the historical museum field and provides professional development to educators, museum professionals, environmental organizations, government officials, and more concerning tribal sovereignty, history, relationships, and self-determination. In his current role, Brad serves part-time as the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Aquinnah Cultural Center, located in the Edwin DeVries Vanderhoop homestead in Aquinnah Gayhead. In his full-time role, Brad is the Native American Teacher Retention Initiative Program Manager in the Mashpee Wampanoag Education Department. When not working, Brad is pursuing further education and being in relation with the world around us. And Brad's presentation today is entitled Sequan, Historical Perpetuity Through Relations and Time. So I'm going to admit a few more people and welcome Brad to share his presentation today.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Crystal, for the introduction too as well. Thank you all for taking the time to join me this afternoon and for talking about this topic. So I'm going to share my screen in just a second. And so just a heads up for folks. Okay, so you should see my slideshow. Okay, I don't want that view. Okay, hold on.
Set.
I have to switch the view. Here we go. Okay, apologize about that, everyone. So today we're really here to talk about spring, or kind of how I see it and a lot of other folks that are indigenous to the Dawnland see it, is really kind of the new year. And so this is an opportunity for us to talk about our more than human relations and kind of the roles they play in our worldview and also our cultural perpetuity as people. So I'm going to dive into some of these topics today. 3 of the big relatives that I'm going to be focusing on today are herring, eel, and whales, but we'll talk about a few others too as well. And when I say that term relatives, I use it because, in many circumstances, that's how we see, they might be kind of thought of as animals in some circumstances or plants, or other things too as well. But for many Indigenous people here in the Dawnland, these are our relatives. They're family, they're cousins, they're part of our oral traditions, and they're part of our lifeways and have been for 10,000 plus years. And so I'm really going to dive into that topic today and share with you all some of those stories and some of those relationships, and also kind of get into some of the bigger themes tied to this. So, like I said earlier, my name is Brad Lopes, and I'm a Aquinnah Wampanoag tribal citizen. And I can start that in English, but I could also say to you all, Winiki Sakwami, Natasuis Brad Lopes, Wana Notomas Aquinnah. And so, good day, everyone. My name is Brad Lopes, and I'm from Aquinnah. My blood, my bones, my soul come from Aquinnah. In my part-time role, like Crystal is sharing, I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator for the Aquinnah Cultural Center, our Wampanoag History Museum located in the Edwin DeVries Vanderhoop House. That's some of my own family, and so working there is really special and important. And then I'm also in my full-time role, I oversee a grant here in the Mashpee Wampanoag Education Department, supporting and retaining Native American teachers to the field, where it's really critically important that we're present. I also serve on the education committee for for our tribe here in Gay Head, and I graduated from the University of Maine Farmington in 2017, which is located in Wabanaki homelands, some of our cousins to the further north in what is now called Maine and parts of Canada as well. And so that's a little bit about me, but I really want to talk more about our topic today. So to ground ourselves, though, I want to kind of ground ourselves in place first and foremost, as well as time. Not only are we in spring, the new year, a really important time of awakening and kind of beginning for many different things, but where I'm giving this talk today is also located centrally in Wapanee, Watahakimoan, which is Wampanoag homelands. And this is our area that we have called home for over 10,000, if not 12,000 plus years, including the island of Nopi or Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, the Elizabeth Islands, the Cape as well. And as you can see, we're really close to Narragansett homelands and several of our other kind of sister tribes. And so this is where we have been and where we have called home since time immemorial. And I want to kind of emphasize that because for thousands of years, you're talking about very careful relationships with the world around us, as seeing ourselves as part of the world around us, not separate from it. And I'm going to talk about these themes throughout my talk today too as well. And so really centering not only in the time that we're currently experiencing, but also the place in which I am currently situated. And so this place holds a very important kind of place, not only in my heart and all Wampanoag hearts, but also in our worldview, our spirituality, and our understanding of ourselves too. And so when we talk about the land, Aki, it is something that's really can't be divorced from your sense of self. It's like your arm, it's like your soul, it's like your heart. It's something that's a part of you. And that's true for the waterways too as well. Those things really can't be separated in my head. And so really kind of getting us situated in place as we get started. So I'm going to start off by talking about this theme of cultural perpetuity and what I really mean by cultural perpetuity. So cultural perpetuity really refers to a culture's knowledge, values, and practices that are being kind of transferred down from one generation to another generation. And that's that ability for a culture to really be able to ensure that it goes on into the future, hopefully forever. And this is something that's really important, I think, to cultures across the world, not just Indigenous cultures here on Turtle Island, but cultures really across the world. And that's really referring to our transmission of knowledge, practices, beliefs, and skills, primarily in our circumstances from our elders. But oftentimes I think about a lesson that Mashpee Wampanoag elder Gisantanamo told me, which is you should always be listening to your elders and your kids, because those are the two most important teachers. They have the most knowledge, they have the most wisdom, and there's a lot of things that they really have to share with us that we need to be listening to and learning from as well. And really, when we're talking about cultural perpetuity, what is the point of it? Well, it really ensures that a community continues and survives through whatever challenges it faces, but also opportunities as well. And the other thing with cultural perpetuity is it extends beyond individual needs and really emphasizes that it's about a community, it's about the community, and it's about your culture too, as well, moving forward in time. For us, we talk oftentimes about this seven generations worldview, this need to plan and think seven generations ahead. Those that have already left this world and have moved on into the spirit world, those that are not born yet, these are two kind of parties that play a key role in all decision making for Indigenous people here. Because even though they might not be here currently with us, we still have to think about what they either went through before or what they might go through in the future too, as well. And so when we're thinking about things and even about ourselves, it's really hard to think about you just as an individual because you're a part of a larger community and you're a part of a larger worldview that really thinks about things in terms of the future, if not seven generations out, much further too as well. And it's critically important that, we talk about cultural perpetuity because it emphasizes cultural preservation, the transmission of knowledge across time, and Indigenous ways of being and thinking too as well. And it's also important because it contributes heavily to our collective well-being, identity, and our belonging. It centers those kinds of things. And when we're really kind of thinking about, the collective, the group itself, that is again kind of a a way of being too that you're going to see more often amongst the indigenous people of the Dawnland and of Turtle Island too as well. I have found that today in the United States that the predominant culture that we see, this predominantly white culture, can be very individualized, can be very much about the individual. And you even notice it in language too as well pretty frequently. But the other thing that's important about cultural perpetuity is that it really emphasizes cooperation. And that is key to maintaining traditions, key to maintaining culture, key to remaining continuing identity too as well. And so we're really talking about cultural perpetuity. It's a collective effort to ensure that your people move forward in time, grounded in traditions, grounded in cultural beliefs and practices, and making sure that you're transferring that on to future generations. Now, the visual I have here is hopefully a little bit familiar to some people in the room. This is a visual that comes from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And Maslow is a educational kind of researcher, somebody that many folks, if they're going through teacher training, will encounter Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you're in some sort of like social care setting, you might have also seen it too as well. And what Maslow's hierarchy is really looking at is how can the individual truly achieve themselves? How can they actualize themselves? How can they grow into a healthy, kind of well-meaning individual? And one of the things too that a lot of people might not be familiar with is where did Maslow get the majority of his work? Where was he inspired to do this kind of thing? Well, one of the things I always like to share with folks is that Maslow honestly took most of what he gathered here from Blackfoot people. Now, Blackfoot people are also Algonquin language speakers, so they're part of a much larger language family that kind of extends through parts of the West into parts of the East and kind of goes up and down the East Coast of what we now know as the United States and parts of Canada too as well. And in the Blackfoot worldview, which is true for many Indigenous people too as well, self-actualization is really just the first part of a greater story. And it really emphasizes that realizing yourself and coming into your own is really just one step of a much greater process. And in their model, oftentimes when you see it, it's even constructed around a house. And so, really, that second part of their pyramid is community actualization. How are you contributing to the community, and how is the community growing into its own and its own well being? And how is it emphasizing communal ways of being too, as well? Now, each one of these factors, realizing yourself and then also realizing the community realizing itself, coming into its own actualization, contributes to this greater effort of cultural perpetuity. And so, again, looking at a different perspective, when we have it in the Western perspective, it is very kind of minimalized to the individual, and it doesn't go much beyond that. Now, when we look at different perspectives, and particularly the Blackfoot perspective, we're seeing that this self is just one part of a much greater story. And so when people really kind of are looking into Maslow's hierarchy, I encourage you to check out some of the really great research that has come out by Indigenous researchers recently concerning kind of the origins of where a lot of this came from. And again, harkening back to Maslow's time spent with Blackfoot people. And so taking this and kind of moving forward, I really want to talk to you all about kind of our own cultural perpetuity and how we have maintained this, and particularly with our relationships with spring and our more than human relatives. Because spring is a critically important time. It's really a time that I kind of think of as awakening. When I think about the cycle of time, I kind of see it as awakening, kind of growing, kind of harvesting, and then resting. And that's kind of the way I almost see like the four seasons in my head too as well. But when we're really talking about awakening, one of the things I like to emphasize are three R words, which are relationships, responsibilities, and reciprocity. And again, kind of a change of worldview, even with language. So when I do civics work in particular here in the United States, I find that oftentimes we're talking about rights. And I'll talk a little bit about rights today too as well. But when we're in conversations as Indigenous people, oftentimes I find that our civic conversation is more around responsibilities, the responsibilities that we have. And these are, we're talking about thousands of years of maintained responsibilities and relationships, in particular with our more than human relatives. This is something that's been going on for as long as we can remember in our oral traditions, because we're a part of the land and the land is a part of us. And we're also part of the water, and the water is a part of us too as well. being Aquinnah Wampanoag, I think often about our ancestors and how often they were probably spending on the waterways. So I have a theory that I think for some folks, they are probably on the water just as much, if not more, than they were on the land. And these relationships are tied to the seasonality, tied to our sense of time, and tied to land and water worldviews. Oftentimes, I think about time, I think about the turtle's back too, as well. And how, for many turtle species, when you look at their shell, for example, you'll see in kind of the center area, there are 13 kind of core squares, for lack of a better word. And usually around the outer edge of that shell, there are usually about 28 smaller squares. And what you come to find out is that the turtle is telling time. And that's because the turtle on its back, in many circumstances, has a lunar calendar. And so you're thinking about worldview, you're talking about people who also tell time or think about time primarily through 13 moons and not through suns necessarily. And so this is kind of critically important for understanding even our sense of time. These practices and traditions too are tied to culturally held responsibilities that are get passed down from generation to generation. We have responsibilities and reciprocity that we need to engage with the world around us. And these are things that help maintain balance and stewardship moving forward. And stewardship is never my favorite word. I think a lot of other Native folks feel that way, just because, again, in that kind of context, it almost places human beings above other kind of relations here on this planet. And really, when we're talking about how this knowledge is transferred, how these practices are transferred, and all of this different kind of stuff, we're talking about the role of storytelling and oral traditions. And that's where the time period just before us, winter, plays a really key role, because that's oftentimes when you're going to see knowledge be transferred historically and contemporarily today. And so that's a time where you're spending with your families, with your community in some circumstances. And this knowledge systems, these practices are handed down from one generation to another to then carry it forward and hand off to that next generation afterwards too as well. And we regularly engage in reciprocity with the world around us and the gifts given to us because that's how we see it. These are gifts needed for us to survive. In a lot of worldviews, we're talking about human beings as actually not being at the top of a pyramid, but actually being considered kind of the lowliest of all creatures. And that's because we need all of our relations to actually survive. But it's about being engaged in a critical relationship with them that emphasizes balance and reciprocity. Because otherwise, it's very easy to fall into what I see often in the West, which is an extraction based mindset through markets, where you're just extracting resources and feeding markets. And those markets oftentimes negatively impact those same said resources. And again, when we're talking about this, I emphasize that we see ourselves as part of the natural world, not separate from it. I think today it's very easy to perceive ourselves as separate from the natural world, largely because we're surrounded by, four walls, we're inside often. But when we think about for many cultures around the world, if not all, I would argue that there's much more of a land and water based origin, a true relationship with the land. And I think for many folks in Europe, they've unfortunately have lost that relationship over time. And so I think there's a desire, though, to find that again. Now, here on the right hand side, you can also see a calendar of sorts that was recorded from Chief Wildhorse from Mashpee, talking about the different moons, the different months. And here you can see some that got kind of bundled up together. There are 13 in there. There actually is some more references in there too as well. But when I'm looking at March and April towards the very bottom, we're talking about the time of catching fish. So even as we move through time, it's giving us signals and giving us signs that we're now transitioning into a time period of fishing, of shell fishing, of also beginning to essentially prepare our fields for planting too, as well as we move into May. And these are really critically important time periods. So having that relationship with the world around us, watching the stars, watching the moon, watching the way that everything is responding to changes as spring is awakening, really tells us it's now time to move forward with these practices and with these traditions. And for many Wampanoag people today, too, fishing is something that is near and dear to our hearts. I think that's true for really a lot of Native people here on the East Coast, too, as well, and elsewhere. And so this is really a key time in which we're talking about that relative and the role they play, not only in our sustenance, but in our sense of time, our worldview, our spirituality, quite literally our cosmology. And so, again, thinking about this time period and how we're even thinking about it through these different moon phases. This is another kind of way of thinking about it. This was actually just a kind of like a calendar of sorts put together by Gisantanamo from Mashpee. And so here we can see kind of the different seasons and the different kind of concepts going on. And we really get into spring too. Another thing that I always look forward to are the rise of the strawberries, come like late May, June usually. And that's a time period where that berry plays a really key role. Many tribal nations are practicing strawberry Thanksgivings during that time period, and really engaging in reciprocity and thanking practices too as well for this gift given to us. Now we're just kind of also entering out of almost the maple season too as well, which is really when a time where many folks that particularly live inland, and a little bit further north too as well, are really spending time with sugar maples and the important gifts that relative is giving to them. Now, as we move forward and we're thinking about summer, we're really getting ready for green corn. And that's a time period where many tribal nations are also engaged in practices of thanks and reciprocity towards green corn. We have things like Skimitzin, which is primarily the Mashantucket Pequot Nation, um, ensuring that this celebration moves forward every year and that this giving of thanks happens too as well. And so when we think about time too as well, it's very much circular. It's very much kind of coming back to itself. And so these cycles are really important for understanding our culture and understanding how to transfer it forward to as well to future generations. The first relative I really want to talk about are eels. So eels play a key role not only in sustenance but in worldview. So they're usually our first guests, kind of come this time period. Now eels are usually kind of moving sometimes in the opposite direction of herring. They're kind of doing the opposite thing, but they play such a key role in kind of sustenance and our worldview. They're a sense that really now is the time that spring is awakening, and we need to prepare to plant our fields. We need to prepare to move some of our houses. We need to really prepare the next steps in our lives. And in some circumstances, the eel can even act as a ceremonial fish. It can act as a way of literally healing yourself and rebirthing yourself upon that new time period of the year. And so, eel is considered a very important relative in many cases. And we've seen lots of impacts to this relative through various different means too, as well. And this is a relative too that for many of us is not only for us as Indigenous people is sustenance, but when many colonizers come to our homelands, this also becomes a source of sustenance for them as well. Now we're talking about like a great source of sustenance for preventing osteoporosis, a great source of sustenance of omega-3s. You're looking at eel. Eel plays such a key role in preventing some of those things and really ensuring a healthy diet moving forward. Traditionally, you're talking about our ancestors regularly living into their 80s and 90s. And I do know of several documented cases where people are suggesting they're in their hundreds. And this is actually, I largely believe this is because of our diet and because of our way of being, our practices around being in shape too as well, and the role things like running play in our cultures, in our communities, historically, and even today. Running is a very sacred practice. And so when I think about relatives, I think about spring, eels are always one of the first ones to kind of tell us time is changing. And they play such a key role in our well being. And so it's critically important when we engage with the eel that we're also thinking about how to make sure the eel population is healthy too moving forward. And today, as I said earlier, there have been various challenges to eel populations. And this will be true for the next relative I talk about as well. Sequan the moss, which is herring. When I think about herring, we even kind of call it in Wampanoag and other languages too around this area, this is the spring fish. This is the fish that literally brings spring with it in many circumstances. When the herrings start running, we know, okay, spring is fully here, and it's now time to really make sure we're engaged in those transitions that the eel was also showing us we need to begin. And again, talk about a heavy omega-3 hitter. Not only that, but you're talking about the ability to smoke herring. And that tradition right there is also really important. Most recently, just this last week, Mashpee had their herring festival, which is always a really lovely event for the community. And that's where we're actually transferring a lot of this knowledge onto the next generation. So that day, there was tons of kids out there just engaged in the practice of learning this process and also smoking the herring. Now, This is another relative that has had a lot of impacts to their natural environment, whether it's dams or pollution. These folks have had to deal with quite a bit. And they play a key role not only in our sustenance, but in the sustenance of other relatives too as well. So when we're thinking about those barriers that have impacted them, these are barriers that impact kind of the whole rest of the ecosystem too as well. So even here in Mashpee too as well, when we're thinking about the herring, one of the things that has been a concern of the Mashpee community in particular is the cyanobacteria that has really kind of raided Mashpee Wakeby Pond, which is an area that the herring always kind of come back to. It's one of their homes. And so as they kind of move up that herring run and into the pond, one of the things that they're faced with today is this increased level of pollution. And that increased level of pollution largely actually came with the development in Mashpee. So Mashpee, alongside other kind of communities here, was one of the fastest growing communities in the 1980s. It led to a lot of development in the community. And now a lot of the runoff from that is unfortunately polluting waterways. And so this is a problem that we're still dealing with today. So many obstacles have been thrown in this relative's way, but they still prosper. They still move forward and they still do their thing. And as a Wampanoag person, I find a lot of inspiration in that life story, in that story that they have to tell, because I think it's something that we can relate to as Indigenous people here in the Dawnland, where we're often invisible and we're often not even a part of conversations that we really need to be a part of. I'd like to call attention too to some of the important work that's been done in Mashpee around what's called the rights of nature and the state of herring. So this is work that's been done, and we won't watch the videos for time, but I'll share the presentation. You all can watch them too as well. Where really we're talking about the fact that these relatives do have rights. When we're thinking about Western legal systems and how they often emphasize rights, we really want the Western legal systems to understand, okay, we see that our relatives do have rights, whether they're eels, herring, whales, whatever it might be. They have rights. And we have a responsibility to protect them and protect those rights too as well because of the gifts that they give us. And so this is an effort largely led by tribal youth here in Mashpee to ensure that the right of herring are protected, they're recognized, and that we have a good understanding of what the state of the herring is. What is their health, their population health. And so this effort has been really important, has led to actually even the passing of some tribal laws here around here in Mashpee that really emphasize that we have a rights of herring ordinance, and we have a again recognizing the need to take care of these relatives and hopefully share that need with the greater kind of society around us too as well. But again, this is something that we face many barriers in each and every year. And I'll share more about that towards the end of the presentation. Hold on. Ooh, there we go. The next relative I really want to talk about is puta or whale. And whales are so critically important, not only to Wampanoag worldview, but also of many coastal Indigenous people, not only here on the East Coast, but also on the West Coast and other various parts of the world too as well. Now, this is a relative that is quite literally our cousin. They are, for us in many circumstances, they are our transformed cousins just in a different form. And today, this one in particular, the Northern Atlantic right whale, is facing all sorts of threats and could even face extinction. And this is something that really breaks my heart because each time one leaves this world, it is no different than a family member leaving this world. It's no different than losing a grandmother or a mother. And so that heartbreak is very real. And they have played such a key role in our sustenance and our ways of being as people that we also think of them as gifts from Moship. And Moship, for many Aquinnah Wampanoag people, many Wampanoag people, many Mohegan people, and other folks too here, represents kind of this very important figure in our worldview and our storytelling. And Moship is very responsible for making sure that we were safe, that we were also healthy, and that we knew how to be in relation with all the things around us. Many of us think of Moship as quite literally our first school teacher. So when I think of whales, again, they play such a key role in our understanding of ourselves, but also our cosmology. So what I usually wear a lot of days is actually a wampum necklace made to shape just like a whale. And I do that again because it's a reminder that many of our cousins do not live on the land, they live in the waterways. And that role that they play is not only critical for our survival, but it's critical for the planet's survival too, as well. Today, they face many threats, particularly from entanglement, from speeding vessels, and also what we've seen recently, which is the development of wind farms off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, too, as well. And even though we might be a fan of green energy as a tribe, seeing this kind of be developed in our own backyard has been quite challenging and heartbreaking in many circumstances because we're very concerned about the impact it has on our relatives, but also areas in which our folks most likely lived and interacted in when the ocean level was much lower, too, as well. Again, recognizing that we have been here since even before the island was an island. And so, again, reflecting back to our own oral traditions, which talk about Mashab creating this place, separating it from the mainland. And I've always seen that story really as a tradition of the ice sheets moving. And so I see Mashab as an oral rendition of those glaciers, of those ice sheets moving. And so when I think about that, I think about how long and how much time that oral tradition might have actually seen. I wanted to share some cool whale stories. So on the right-hand side, you can see Mashab. Now, this is actually a drawing that's really special to me, only because I had a student do this drawing one time. And it was just kind of like, wasn't for a school project or anything, just something they wanted to do. And at Mashab's feet, you can see two whales. And that's because in some of our oral traditions, we talk about how when Mashab separated the island from the mainland, and there are different versions of the story, that some of his children fell into the ocean. And some of his children, in an effort to rescue them, he transformed them into whales. In another version of the story, he transforms them into whales because he understands that there are colonizers coming to our homelands. And they don't want to leave, they want to stay, but he wants to make sure they can be safe, recognizing the great threat that this poses to our people. And so he transforms them into whales. In some stories, they're orcas specifically. In other stories, they're the different kind of species, different whales that we see today. And again, recognizing that these are our relatives, these are our cousins. And so they are our family. One of the things I like to say is that they have our oldest songs. So when whales are singing, I think about them as our oldest songs. They're some of our oldest tradition keepers. And so they're knowledge keepers too, as well. And so even when you see whales and the way that they interact with each other, you really get that sense too, as well, their socialness and their love for one another. Now, on the top hand left, I also have a map of Witch's Pond. Witch's Pond is located just off of Squibnocket and just off of Moships Trail in Aquinnah and Chilmark area. And this also has a key whale story associated with it. Midark, who is oftentimes considered one of the last sachems of Aquinnah, before transitioning into more of a township model, or Indian township, as the district would call it, is essentially kind of tells a story towards the end of his life, in which there is a tunnel, apparently, between Witch's Pond and the ocean. And that tunnel would actually be a source of travel and a source of refuge for a very large white whale. And Midark is said to have shared a story upon his death that when that white whale rises out of Witch's Pond, we know that there are newcomers. We know there are colonizers coming. And this is a story that was recognized and recalled by Amos Smalley when Amos Smalley returned after taking the life of a white whale while whaling. And so in many cases, Amos recalled that story and felt like it was coming true in that moment. And even since Amos's time, we've seen significant changes to Aquinnah, to Gayhead, and to the island as well. That's also true for Mashpee and other Wampanoag communities too, that have seen significant colonization and change actually within just the last really 100 years. And again, emphasizing that colonization is not something that really ever stopped. It's actually an ongoing process that continues to today, unfortunately, and will likely continue into the near future, but hopefully someday does not continue. Towards the bottom left-hand side, I have a map of Nantucket. So again, recognizing the very close connections we also have to Nantucket. This is also true. You can see this documented very easily from folks that live in Chappaquiddick, who are actually regularly engaged with through marriage and through other means with the Nantucket communities. And what you're seeing here is what's called a drift whale map. So this map is showing you where whales are drifting onto the shore in Nantucket historically. That black area, for example, is where they saw a lot of whales drifted to the shore. Now, these are again considered a gift from Masha. And so when they drift up to the shore, it's quite literally like a sustenance gift, a gift of from again from Masha. And what you're seeing here, and particularly the names like Spotzo and Musquat, is these are individual Wampanoag sachems who are actually ensuring through two different methods that no matter what happens with English colonization, that their community's rights to those drift whales are protected and enshrined. And they do it through two means. Their traditional means that we've always maintained and practiced. And now, by this time period, recognizing that you also have to do it through an English legal method, or else the English will never honor or recognize that. And even when you do that, in many circumstances historically, it still was not honored and recognized. However, sachem drift whale rights have been something that we've tapped into in our own community most recently when there was a right whale who unfortunately, no, actually, I don't remember if it's a right whale. I forget the exact whale it was, but they washed ashore in Edgartown most recently. And this was something that we tapped into and we reminded the communities, hey, we have the right to be with our ancestor. We have the right to be with our relative. And we have the right to conduct ceremony and also to engage with the gifts that they're giving us. And so this is something that's critically important to our worldview and many folks that live in the same kind of coastal waterways that these whales share. Next, I just want to talk about some other relatives I really think about with spring. So, one of the other ones is skunks. Skunks I think about a lot because they're adorable and I just love them. But besides that, even when we think about the word skunk, skunk, or skunkit for the place of skunks, we're really thinking about a word that in English is derived from the Algonquin languages here. So there are many, many words in the English language that are actually derived directly from our languages. And so skunk is one of them. That's literally the one who sprays you, the one who ejects fluid. And they play such a key role because they mate usually every February, March. And so they're up and active. They're engaged in literally bringing their next generation and ensuring their culture moves forward too as well every spring. And so they're really awakening. This is why you might smell skunk more often during those months too as well. Now, traditionally speaking, they're also considered a delicacy in many ways because if you know how to prepare them and you know how to cook them, the meat is very rich and nutrient rich as well. And this is often something that many Wampanoag youth and other Native youth in this region would engage with. Usually one kid is going out and actually trying to get the skunk to spray you because what that skunk will do is turn around and get ready to kind of clinch its glands area. And another kid that's usually hiding will come out, grab it by the base of the tail, lift its legs up, and move forward with the process. And when you lift their legs up by the base of their tail, it actually kind of prevents them from being able to spray you. And so again, this is another really important relative when we think about our sense of time, and I think about spring in particular. The next one is sturgeon. Oftentimes we think about Massachusetts or Rhode Island, we probably don't think about sturgeon, but this is an area that sturgeon also used to call home, and in many circumstances still do. I know of one that shows up pretty regularly in the Taunton River, for example. However, they're more commonly found more north as well today. But that's largely due again to fishing practices, pollution, and other factors like climate change that are unfortunately driving some of our relatives out of this region. But this is an old ancestor. This is an ancestor that has not changed much over the last couple of really thousands, if not millions of years. When I think about them, I think also of the horseshoe crab and how that's also a relative that has kind of this design that has stood up over time and continues today with their presence and kind of their own kind of cultural perpetuity in many ways. But the spring is also a really critically important time for them. And they're moving around during this time period. This is when many people start to notice them for the first time. And so they are a magnificent kind of relative and really emphasize that longevity of their own people, their own culture as a relative. Another one I want to talk about are striped bass. And so these play such a key role in our sustenance cycles and are really heavily moving around this time period, if not earlier as well, kind of making their way up. And one of the things that we have noticed most recently in Aquinnah is actually some of them are choosing to actually stay. And this is a really kind of shocking sign because they're not usually a fish that usually stays and overwinters. Now, that could be a sign of other factors. It could be a sign in particular of climate change. which is very concerning. So climate change and other factors that many Indigenous people have contributed extremely little to, if nothing at all, are now critically impacting these cycles and these ways of being, to the point where some of these fish, some of these relatives are staying longer than they normally do, or in some circumstances, overwintering, and really kind of making their presence known. Now, we're still waiting to see the impacts of that too, as well. Now, shellfish and quahogs, they play a critical role in the spring as well as kind of into the summer. This is one of your main sustenance sources, but also plays a key role in lots of oral traditions, storytelling, and the transfer of knowledge, in particular when quahog becomes wampum. And one of the things I always like to share about here is that it requires an Indigenous person working with that actual shell, being in relationship with that shell, talking to it, being engaged in prayer and offering for it to become wampum. And wampum is critical for the transference of knowledge, for community agreements, for offerings, and other factors too as well. And really, the last thing I ever want people to think about it as is money. That's really only something that becomes a concept in Dutch and English worldviews and never takes hold in our world. And today, even when I think about that, I think about the people that do wampum art too as well, or wampum work too as well, and how critically important it is to ensure that it is Native folks doing it. Because without that touch, without that pray, without that spiritual connection, it doesn't become wampum. It just becomes quahog jewelry. And in my opinion, I feel very strongly that when non-Native people work with quahog, it is almost sacrilegious. And so this is a very, very important relative that today we're also seeing the effects of environmental changes. In many circumstances, quahogs and other shellfish are being farmed today. And the conditions in which they're farmed actually does not produce the same colors on the shell that we're normally used to seeing. And in other circumstances, they're changing other colors too as well. And so this has to do with, again, their filter system, what they're intaking, because they're a filter feeder. And they play such a critical role in all of their ecosystems to help filter out pollution, other kind of things from this areas. Now, one as well that I always look forward to is fiddleheads. Fiddleheads, every time they pop up out of the ground, they are such a nutrient rich source of sustenance. And they also, in my opinion, represent community. Many examples of fern, and particularly fiddleheads, they like to grow in clusters and families. And so when you're engaging with those families, they're quite literally a community. And so when you're engaging with the fiddleheads and other kind of relatives like fiddleheads, there are certain protocols you really want to ensure you're following. And one person that did a great job, I think, of synthesizing many of these protocols most recently was Robin Wall Kimmerer in her book, The Serviceberry, where she breaks down some common themes held by many Indigenous people when it comes to actually engaging with these relatives and harvesting them. And a lot of that has to do with reciprocity and ensuring that there are always more for others and always a continuity of that relative moving forward. So again, really critically nutritious, valuable, but only here for a short time too as well. So really, really important for our well-being. Here we just have a small sugar maple. One of the things I always like to share about the sugar maple are some of the stories around it, where people actually talk about how in the very beginning, before there was actually a lot of water in sugar maples too as well, that in particular in this story, it was told to me from Wabanaki people, where they talked about Gluskop, who Gluskop again is another giant in their kind of worldview. And Gluskop is looking everywhere one day for the people and he can't find them anywhere. He's not sure where they are. And then all of a sudden he hears some noise from the woods. And when he goes into the woods, he finds all the people are sleeping or half asleep really underneath maple trees, literally drinking the sap. And so what Gluskop did in that story was actually add water to the trees. So then there had to be much more of a laborious process to it. So this is just one of the stories and traditions around maple trees and kind of the gifts that they're able to give us. In many circumstances for folks like our own folks, you might be trading with folks that are more inland for this kind of really valuable gift that's given to us. And again, I always think of this as kind of that sign that spring's on its way, that we're kind of getting into this much warmer time period because that sap is really running in the trees again. We're also talking about traditional home building. This is a critically important time for you to actually go out and harvest bark, because the spring is actually a time period where the sap is running just enough in most trees where you can actually go in and actually peel the bark off of those trees like band-aids. And that bark literally becomes part of our wikuash, our houses. And in many circumstances historically, you're talking about folks using old growth elm and chestnut, which had extremely thick, durable bark. Today, when we do it, we're oftentimes dealing with, new growth species that haven't been around as long, haven't had that time to really grow and develop. We're also dealing with the fact that the American chestnut and many of the elms are largely wiped out, largely due to disease and other factors. And that really kind of impacts our way of even understanding the landscapes, but also carrying on these critical traditions forward. This next one I really want to talk about is the black willow. Now, black willow plays a critical role because it's basically aspirin. It's basically a pain reliever. So when I work often with students, I'm asking them, where do medicines come from? And usually, they get to it eventually that, oh, they come from our plants, our plant relatives. And black willow not only plays a critical key role in kind of that pain relief, when you can go out and harvest very small pieces of the bark in kind of the springtime to do that, but for many women too, it also plays a critical role in the game double ball. So I won't go too much into that because it's not my place. However, this plays a critical role, and many sticks used in that game are actually from black willow trees. And that has to do with the healing factor of that game and what it's really intended for. So that's really all I wanted to share about the black willow. The last thing I really want to talk about before we just open up for questions is what I call ontological challenges in Wampanoag continuance. So ontology is really kind of, if you had to define it, refers to the nature of being, how you think about yourself, your own being, but also your people's being, and your sense of place in this world. And as Wampanoag people and many other Indigenous people, if not all, unfortunately, on Turtle Island, we're oftentimes being prevented, harassed, or unable to continue in many of these practices and relationships. And this can actually pose what's called an ontological crisis, a crisis of being. If you're not able to engage with those responsibilities, to engage in that reciprocity, then it quite literally causes a crisis and causes a challenge. In many circumstances, we're talking about herring, for example, every single year, I feel like I see a video of a tribal citizen being harassed by somebody who's non-native for harvesting herring, not recognizing that we have Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights as recognized by the Supreme Court, and that we have the ability to do this. Not only do we have the ability to do this, but the way in which we engage with that harvesting is critically different than the way that many Western economic systems also engage in harvesting. It is non-extractive and is meant to be engaged with reciprocity in that 7 generations worldview, that we have to critically maintain these for all of our children and all of the other ecosystem factors too as well that these relatives contribute to. And really, when we're talking about kind of this challenge, though, it is challenges to our responsibilities and our reciprocity. Because oftentimes, when decisions are made around these relatives, they do not involve our voices or our decision making. We're usually left out of these conversations. And if we're involved, it's usually well after the fact. And so we continue to inhabit our homelands today, not only on the islands, but across the mainland as well. And so I have up for you all here just to see 3 of the tribal seals that are out there. For example, the Mashpee seal, our seal in Aquinnah, and Herring Pond seal too as well. And these are our government seals, quite literally our tribal seals. And that's because we have government to government relations, or we should have government to government relations. In many circumstances, the United States does not honor its trust and treaty responsibilities to tribal nations. And unfortunately, this impacts our relation with our more than human relatives, because whether we are prevented, harassed, or unable to actually engage in those responsibilities as we wish to and as we want to. And really, kind of all of this, moving forward with these responsibilities, is key to our cultural perpetuity and our sovereignty as well, with our more than human relations, but also ourselves as people. The last thing I want to end on is a call, and it's a call for actually more efforts for co-stewardship, first and foremost. To me, that's the bare minimum. I think there needs to be more efforts where these land and water spaces that our more than human relatives inhabit are essentially stewarded, even though, again, I don't care for that word necessarily, by co-stewardship models, which you see somewhat with the National Park Service and other agencies, which have made an effort to ensure whatever decision making is going on, that tribal voices are also involved in that decision making in key structural ways, not in tokenizing ways. The other thing I would make a call for, which is really the end goal, which is land and water back models. So we're really talking about how to give land and water spaces back to tribal nations to ensure that we can actually move forward with these responsibilities and that our sovereignty can be honored. In many circumstances, tribal nations actually only have some sort of control over an extremely small amount of our traditional territory. What this ultimately results as is in many cases we're unable to actually move forward with these responsibilities, and it makes providing for our own people extremely challenging. And so, really, we're looking at an effort to ensure that we can be truly self sustained and self determined. And that is going to require more efforts to return water and land spaces back to tribal nations. And I think there are tons of creative ways to kind of do this. And there are tons of creative ways already out there. Now, I would call attention to folks like the Native Land Conservancy and Mashpee and other models that have been done all across the country and elsewhere. And I really do think that there is an effort and a moment in which these spaces can be returned back to our peoples and can be seeing much more traditional models of engagement and relationship and really emphasize what I learned from Mi'kmaq speakers as two-eyed seeing, which is seeing with both eyes, in one eye using the strengths of Western science, but the other eye that is oftentimes closed in these circumstances with indigenous traditional ecological knowledge that has been passed down from generation to generation for thousands of years. Most of the things that we've seen negatively impact the environment have been here for really the last 350 years. Now, there's a strong correlation to settler colonialism there, if not a direct causation. And so we really have to do the work that's going to actually erase or actually reverse that in many circumstances. And that's going to take a lot of societal changes. But I think if we do not do those societal changes and lean into traditional ecological knowledge, then unfortunately we may no longer be here as human beings. So I'm going to end on that call. I'll share with you all. Thank you, everyone. My contact, if you'd like to reach out to me at any point, is education@aquinnah.org. My phone number is 207-680-5229. Feel free to give me a call or shoot me a text. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll open it up for questions. But I wanted to end by saying thank you, everyone.
So Gwen Edwards asked, are there still lots of eels and herring in local water?
Ooh, yeah, there are still quite a bit. I mean, um, there's been lots of eel counting efforts going on, kind of throughout, kind of this region and elsewhere. And one of the things that I was always, because I spent a lot of time in Wabanaki homelands, kind of growing up as well. And one of the things that I got to see a lot up there is their relationship with eels and how oftentimes they are still engaged in that very, important, critically cultural relationship with eel relatives too as well. So yes, there's quite a bit. I would say probably not as much as there used to be, unfortunately, because when you look at some of the historical documents, you're talking about people talking about almost being able to walk on the water because of the amount of eels that were present.
Let's see if there are any other questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. Robin Devon asked, did Native people only harvest whales that drifted ashore?
Good question. No, not necessarily. There are examples of us actually going out and engaging with kind of close to shore whales in kind of a very intentional kind of hunting practice. But again, you're talking about a very small scale kind of effort and also a very strategic and smart effort because these relatives are, that's their home. They know how to tussle in that place. And that's also something you could be very thoughtful around. Traditionally, you're talking about primarily drift whales with the occasional hunting of one too as well or hunting of whales. And today, for example, if you look at the Makah tribe in I think Washington State area, they've actually been able to work out an agreement with NOAA and other federal agencies to ensure that they can continue their ceremonial whale hunt every year too as well. And so we're even thinking about these things too in kind of whale conservation circles. One of the things I usually have to get into is kind of how critically different that approach is to the threats that whales face today. And I understand why there might be pushback towards any sort of traditional hunt of whales. However, again, we're thinking about a much different approach to it.
And we have time for one more. Emily asks, whoops, whenever I go to read it, there are more coming. Are there any models you've seen or been moved by that involve collaborations between academic researchers and TEK scientists that work according to these cycles?
Yeah, I can't think of a specific example, except I would always kind of call I think academia has lots of power, whether it is social power, whether it's political power, whether it is legal power, or even financial power. In many circumstances, too, one of the things I'd like to encourage of academics, Western academics, to do is to truly engage in relationship work with tribal communities. And what that really means is that that work is not your intellectual property. That intellectual property is the tribal nations. And that's critically important, is that to also understand that when you're engaging with tribal communities, is that you're engaging with essentially intellectual property that needs to be respected and honored, as well as it's honored in Western traditions too as well. Now, I think there are some folks in kind of academic fields who have made a great effort of this, and have done a lot of work to ensure that whatever research they're doing is not extractive in nature. And so, really, you have to ask yourselves, like, if that research is being done, is it community based and community focused? And do I have community consent? In many scientific circles, I'm drawing a blank on the specific organization. They even have some policies around getting consent from tribal nations if the research that you're doing concerns anywhere on their homelands or home waters as well. And so, really, kind of seeking out even those models too, if you're engaged in that process, I think is critically important because you want to also be in relationship with us in that process. And we're very used to the folks that come into our communities and are just like, okay, tell me this, tell me that. And they leave, go back to their university. We never see them ever again. And we're kind of sick and tired of that. At least a lot of the younger generations, I think, are as well. And we really want to move forward in a way that says, okay, how are you structurally committed to land back and to ensuring tribal nations are healthy and able to be self sustained too, as well? And that's possible through your research and through your own structural relationships too. So there's a lot of privilege, I think, that can be given up in many circumstances from academia, but also other parties.
Thank you, Brad. Well, we've neared the end. There's a couple of more questions, but maybe they can send them to you by email themselves. I'm just going to thank everyone for joining us today. And thank you for this enlightening presentation. I learned so much myself. I took a few notes as well. This presentation has been recorded. It will be made available on Tamaquag's YouTube page in the coming weeks. So if you missed it, want to review it again or share it with others, certainly let them know that it will be on YouTube. And thank you to all of you who joined us today. We won't have a lunch and learn in May. We're going to take a short break, but we will return again the following month for our next session. So if you'll please join us on June 23rd. Kamoni Burke, Narragansett tribal citizen, will share a presentation entitled Our Communion Day, Illuminating the Legacy of Tribal Churches. Also, please follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Be sure to check out our website for these events and others coming up. If you have time tomorrow night, it's our final book club review for our last book is at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. You can check our webpage for details on that. Also, we have some TEK walks. So if you want to get out in nature besides hearing about it, check our website. We have some TEK walks coming up soon that you can register for those. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you for joining today. Thank you, Brad, so much for being willing to share your cultural knowledge and your educational knowledge with us today. And everyone have a wonderful afternoon.
Take care, everyone.